All right, we're going to get started. I just want to welcome everybody to the first of a series of really exciting conversations around surveillance and particularly scrutinizing surveillance. My name is Toni Morgan, and I am director at the Center for Law, Innovation, and Creativity at the Northeastern University School of Law. And I am delighted to introduce you to our panelists for today. We're definitely going to take kind of a standard approach to to Zoom panels, excuse me. But we're hoping that as you're hearing our panelists remark, wow, excuse me, as you hear our panelists share their remarks, if you could just think about some questions that you want to pose not only to the panelists, but to each other, and feel free to share them in the chat. The other thing I want to share before I introduce our panelists is that this session is being recorded and that we are streaming. We are streaming live. I should have brought a glass of water. So pardon me for the little. So yeah, we'll be streaming live, or we are streaming live, and we are currently recording. From there, I'll just jump into the bios and talk about who you will be hearing from today. So Dr. Chris Gilliard is a writer, professor, and speaker. His scholarship concentrates on digital privacy and the intersections of race, class, and technology. He's an advocate for critical and equity-focused approaches to tech in education. His work has been featured in the Chronicle of Higher Education, EDUCAUSE Review, Fast Company, Vice, and Real Life magazine. KADE CROCKFORD is the director for the Technology for Liberty program at the ACLU of Massachusetts. KADE works to protect and expand core First and Fourth Amendment rights and civil liberties in the digital 21st century, focusing on how systems of surveillance and control impact not just society in general, but their primary targets: people of color, Muslims, immigrants, and dissidents. The information age produces conditions facilitating mass communication and democratization, as well as dystopian monitoring and centralized control. The Technology for Liberty program aims to produce unprecedented access to information and communication to protect and enrich open society and individual rights by implementing basic reforms to ensure our new tools not only create inescapable digital cages limiting what we see, hear, think, and do. Towards that end, KADE researches, strategizes, writes, lobbies, and educates the public on issues ranging from the wars on drugs and terror to warrantless electronic surveillance. KADE has written for The Nation, The Guardian, The Boston Globe, WBR, and many other publications, and regularly appears in local, regional, and national media as an expert on issues related to technology, policing, and surveillance. You can find KADE's blog, Privacy Matters, at privacysos.org/blog, the ACLU's dedicated privacy and technology website. Welcome, KADE. RAHSAAN Hall is our final panelist. He is the director of the Racial Justice Program for the ACLU of Massachusetts. In this role, RAHSAAN helps to develop the ACLU's integrated advocacy approach to address racial justice issues. Through legislative advocacy, litigation, and community engagement, the program works on issues that deeply impact communities of color, historically disenfranchised communities. RAHSAAN also manages the ACLU's What a Difference a DA Makes campaign to educate state residents about the power and influence of district attorneys. Prior to joining the ACLU of Massachusetts, RAHSAAN was the deputy director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice, where his work included policy and legislative advocacy, community outreach, and maintaining a litigation caseload of voting rights, police misconduct, and public accommodations cases. RAHSAAN headed up the Voting Rights Project that included the coordination of the statewide election protection initiatives, that included the coordination of the statewide election protection initiatives, voting rights litigation, and his prior involvement in community coalitions on redistricting the last decennial census. In addition to leading the ACLU, the racial justice program at the ACLU, he also serves on the Hyams Foundation Board of Trustees and is a member of the Massachusetts IOLTA Committee. Welcome, RAHSAAN. So, one of the reasons why CLIC decided to organize this particular series, which we're calling Scrutinizing Surveillance, is because we're noticing in this particular moment around COVID and around the global uprising and the reckoning for racial justice that there are a lot of stories about either protesters or low-income people or low-wage workers being monitored and tracked, and questions arising around what that means and the implications of that. So the hope is that our panelists will kind of frame their ideas around what's happening in this moment from their particular perspective, but talk particularly about how this moment is impacting the movement for racial justice and its implications for communities of color, with a particular focus on Black communities. And so I will start by asking KADE to open with some thoughts, and then we'll move on from there.
Thanks, Toni, and hi, everybody. Thanks, Toni, for you for convening this discussion, as well as for the incredible work that you do at CLIC and at the law school. We're really excited to partner with you on this and many other projects. So, you know, we are in a very ripe moment, I think, as a country. In, you know, as Naomi Klein teaches us, in crisis, there's opportunity. And I hope that we're able to perform a little shock doctrine of our own to radically reshape budgets as well as statutes at the local, state, and federal level in response to the demands in the streets and the increasing even calls from major corporations that probably don't really give a shit about Black lives outside of their you know, Excel spreadsheets and their balance sheets. Even those types of institutions are now making noise because it's impossible for people to ignore the demands for justice, and specifically even some of the demands for radical change that we're seeing unfolding across the country, you know, from Puerto Rico to Hawaii. So that is a really exciting framework for us to be having this conversation in. And obviously, you know, it's tragic that the conversation that we're having arose out of the murder of George Floyd and the murder of Breonna Taylor and the killings of so many other Black people by the police across this country. You know, that said, here we are now, and in order to honor those people and in order to honor everyone who suffers from systemic injustice in this country, we better make the best out of this moment in terms of, you know, achieving some real change in this country. So I want to frame my comments about surveillance specifically within the context of what I view as really necessary visioning and leadership that the movement for Black Lives Matter, and other Black scholars and activists have been engaged in, not just over the past few months, but over the past many years. You know, so in June of 2019, last summer, my office, the ACLU of Massachusetts, launched a campaign called Press Pause on Face Surveillance. And this is part of a nationwide movement that the ACLU, organizations like the Center for Media Justice, and many others have been engaged in for a couple years now, really to try to stop government agencies from using face surveillance technology, which, as you probably know, is not only particularly pernicious because of the threats that it poses to all people with respect to our rights as individuals and our collective rights, but also is particularly damaging to Black and Brown people for a variety of reasons that I can get into later, including among them that the technology doesn't work very well for people with darker skin, especially darker skinned women. So, you know, the work that we're doing this campaign has really been made possible by the work of Black radicals and scholars. And so a group of those, you know, one kind of bucket of that work is the scholarly work that we've been seeing, especially from Black women, actually, Joy Buolamwini, Timnit Gebru, and Deb Raji, especially, who have really turned the world's attention, you know, not just activists, not just scholars, but everybody who reads a newspaper or watches the news, to the reality, which is that algorithms can be biased, right? That yes, technology can be inherently racist, not just, it's not just potentially racist in terms of how it's deployed, but it can also be inherently racist. The algorithms themselves can be biased. So you're probably familiar with Joy's path-breaking work on this issue. It's not an exaggeration to say, I don't think, that these three scholars really changed the world with that work, because they changed a lot of minds, I think, in the scientific community too, which for a lot of stupid reasons was operating under the assumption that in fact, technology can't be racist because it's composed of neutral systems, it's math, et cetera, et cetera. You know, that paradigm shift was huge, and they're responsible for it, at least with respect to looking at facial recognition algorithms specifically. So, you know, subsequent to that work, we saw, for example, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, the federal government's standards testing agency, put out a report in December 2019 that basically confirmed a lot of the things that Joy and the Algorithmic Justice League and Timnit and Deb had found in their initial research, which is that these algorithms across many different companies, across different types of deployments, are less likely to perform well when examining the faces, in fact, not only of Black or darker skinned women, but also of young people, elderly people, and women more broadly, finding that, you know, the technology really only works well consistently for middle-aged white men, which is funny because that's kind of how our society works too. So anyway, their work was foundational, but there's also political work that's been done by the Movement for Black Lives, by Black Lives Matter, that has really set the stage for us to be able to offer demands like ban face recognition to our state and local governments. And those are radical abolitionist visions, right? You know, for a long time, people in this country have been, when they think about reforms to our criminal legal system or policing reforms, basically asking for little crumbs, right? Well, you know, we know that lawmakers are scared of kind of a Willie Horton situation, so we're just gonna ask you to please tweak this little thing. Oh, the Rockefeller laws seem really unfair, so can you just kind of reduce the racism in the Rockefeller laws that, you know, make it extend sentences for way longer for crack than for cocaine, or, you know, can we, things like that. And we've seen visions from activists like Miriam Kaba, the abolitionist, from the Movement for Black Lives, which has called for years now to approach reforming the police from an abolitionist perspective. These demands have completely shifted what is possible politically in this country. And so in the context of these two things happening, frankly, movements that have been led predominantly by Black women, actually, both in terms of the scholarship and the radical visioning and activism, there has now been space created in this country for organizations like the ACLU, for people like me and RAHSAAN to step into state legislatures and city halls and say, we don't want you to just reform this, we want you to ban it. And we don't look crazy anymore because people have created the political conditions for us to be able to say those things. So I just, can't give enough credit to those two groups of people broadly who have been, doing the hard academic work, and then also doing the hard organizing work and the hard visioning work to show everybody in this country that another world really is possible and that we can build it. So I think that's all I'll say for my introductory remarks, and I look forward to hearing what folks have to say as well.
Thank you, KADE. I'm just going to pause for a minute, then I'm going to go to RAHSAAN. I just want to welcome those of you who've just joined us. We encourage you, as you listen to each of our panelists' remarks, to think about questions you want to ask the panelists, but also each other, and feel free to use the chat function. And with that, I'm going to turn over to RAHSAAN.
Well, thank you so much, Tony. I appreciate this opportunity to be a part of this very important conversation. As a Northeastern alum, class of 98 law school, I'm always thrilled and proud to see the great things that are happening, especially with CLIC. So this is cool. I think this conversation around surveillance and racial justice, why this matters so much to me is because there's the potential of losing sight of this nation's long story arc of white supremacy and the struggle for Black resistance. And I'm thankful for my colleague KADE, who's very intentional about centering that as a part of the work. And I've seen it in other spaces, but I think that's always important. And when I think about Black people's presence in this country, privacy has always been like this elusive concept for us since time immemorial. When you think about the institution of slavery and the mass amounts of wealth that generated, but also the way that it served as a form of social control, we begin to understand how white supremacy is embedded in our national psyche. Because in order to justify this economic engine, people had to be othered and dehumanized and debased and relegated to a subhuman status. And so upon emancipation, there needed to the white power structure needed to maintain this dominant narrative of white supremacy. And in the absence of slavery, there needed to be other forms of social control. And that's where you see the rise of lynching. But even during slavery, Black folks were being surveilled. And you think about attempted slave rebellions and uprisings of enslaved people, there was always somebody that was going to get information for those in power, who was spying and looking in on and reporting back on as a way to maintain this system of social control and order. And even in the Reconstruction era, more so the post-Reconstruction era, you see the rise of Black codes that criminalize Black behavior and Black communities. And there are enforcement mechanisms, but there is also surveillance, because there are people who are reporting back about people who don't have jobs, or people who don't have appropriate or who are in communities where they're not entitled to be, or people who are engaged in miscegenation, right? And so that's always been happening. And we can skip through the entire telling of history, but you fast forward to the early 1900s, and you think about Black resistance in the form of people like Ida B. Wells or W.E.B. Du Bois, all people who were surveilled by the government because the fight for Black resistance was seen as disruptive to the power structure and our kind of national understanding of who we are and what our values are, and the infrastructure and the political structure of this country. You think of King, you think of the Black Power movement and Black nationalists, and individuals like Huey P. Newton, the COINTELPRO initiative of the federal government. And it just metastasized, moving beyond those Black resistance organization, but even into, Black street gangs. And the justification of maintaining order and public safety is all a part of this longer narrative of this story arc and what has happened to these people who have been dehumanized and debased, and as a way of keeping them relegated to a certain position and status in life. And so when you think about the work of the movement for Black lives and people who are fighting to lift up the status of Black people, to dismantle white supremacy and unshackle us from the chains of oppression that hold us back, that's seen as disruptive, right? These are the people who are the agitators. For as much as Martin Luther King is heralded in our country now, there was a specific period of time where he was hated, not just by Hoover, but by mainstream white folks too. Right. And so we can't lose sight of that. And when we're thinking about, this conversation around Black identity extremists, the kind of this fraudulent label that goes, and it extends beyond the Black community. You think about how the Muslim community is surveilled in unjust and racist and Islamophobic ways. So, the intersection of kind of federal government surveillance and local police surveillance is really disturbing. And I think if we continue to center this conversation in this narrative of the long story arc of white supremacy and the struggle for Black resistance, it makes it better, to KADE's point of saying not just tweaking around the edges, but totally dismantling the system. And when we're talking about it in this way, that enables us to stay motivated and focused on why the system needs to be dismantled.
Thank you so much, RAHSAAN. And I'm excited to turn this over to Chris. I feel like just through the stories that you share online on Twitter and the articles and the things that I've learned, this will be a great way to connect both KADE's points and RAHSAAN's points, but no pressure.
Yeah, thanks for making me go last. I have very little to add. Thanks, first of all, for inviting me, and I'm really honored to be a part of this. But after KADE and RAHSAAN, there's not much more I can add except to say yes to everything they've said. But also to point out, I guess the one thing I would do to link these all together is that much to their points, a lot of these things have been going on for a long time, for the history of America. And we're starting to see, I think, openly, so many of the nightmare scenarios that people have been talking about, and some people have been experiencing, frankly, but people have been talking about for so long, whether that's the surveillance of protesters, people being tracked down by the t-shirt they're wearing or the shoes they're wearing, or people being misidentified and arrested by facial recognition and face surveillance, and that's happening in my own city. There's two that we know of, and so I think one of the things that's unique about this moment is that so many of the things that people have been talking about, and particular communities have experienced, have now been widely distributed and are now widely known in ways that I don't think were. And again, I don't want to say that people didn't know about this, but I think it's been the worldwide movement and dissemination of knowledge has made this more upfront and more present in ways that we didn't have to this point. And I think that's really important because it presents an opportunity for change and disruption and abolition. Again, as KADE said, for years and years and years, people were dismissed when they said that these technologies shouldn't exist, that you shouldn't just, companies and platforms and tech bros shouldn't be able to just throw things out into society. And see what damage is done, and then make some small changes or minor fixes. And so we're seeing widely the damage that these things do. And not only Black folks, not only brown folks, not only marginalized or vulnerable populations are now seeing the harm that that does in ways that I think many people weren't aware of before. And so I think that is an important aspect of this, is that it's become very visible in a way that's pretty much impossible to deny or ignore. And so it presents us, again, the opportunity to make real some of the things that people said were just like kind of fanciful and imaginary.
Absolutely. So thank you for that, Chris. I think we're also seeing through the proliferation of I would call them exposés on companies that are kind of secretly gathering this information and then sharing it, and obviously violating the privacy rights of a bunch of folks, but hiding it under whether it's trade secrets or oh, I didn't know, or like an oops excuse. We're definitely, I think, witnessing in a really important moment in the ways that we think about privacy. So I just want to ask a few questions, and then just so the audience, those of us who are watching, know what this format's going to look like moving forward, the panelists are then going to ask each other a question. And they can pose a question to each other, or they can pose a question to you, and they can also share some additional thoughts. And then we're gonna get to the Q&A. If you haven't already shared your questions, please do so now. So let me just start with the first question. So one of the things that I heard that each of you shared was this idea that there's racism, racial injustice, racism, systemic racism, full stop. Then there's surveillance, which perpetuates a behavior that enables racism. And I think, when we think about, or at least when I think about, initially thought about, surveillance tech, I didn't necessarily, or when I thought about surveillance, I didn't necessarily think about tech surveillance. I just thought about the practice of watching, the practice of watching and policing behavior. And so this question is a very, very broad question, but what the things that all three of you touched on is this idea of, it's also this idea of reform versus complete dismantling, right? And so I would be really interested to hear, your thoughts on how we address the issue of racial injustice in surveillance tech, knowing that racism is full stop one issue, and then the proliferation of technology that is designed to watch communities is another.
Well, I can try to answer that first. I think that, I think of surveillance as a function that enables control. And I think that it's important to think of surveillance that way. There's the old maxim, knowledge is power. When I talk to ordinary people trying to get them to lobby in support of a piece of legislation, or make a phone call to their city councilor or something, or even just to educate people about surveillance, I think that for a lot of people, the maxim knowledge is power doesn't automatically make sense. It doesn't connect for people immediately. It does connect for some people immediately. Those are people, for example, who work in Silicon Valley and know how powerful all of the information that companies like Google and Facebook collect about hundreds of millions or billions of people is. I think that the maximum knowledge is power is really obvious to politicians, for example, who understand instinctively that knowing more than their political opponent gives them an advantage, or that knowing about their constituents, or knowing about the people who are lobbying them gives them an advantage. So I would ask that people really think deeply about what it means that knowledge confers power and authority and control. And so if you think about that, and then you think about institutions that use surveillance technologies, you can't escape the conclusion that surveillance technologies confer authority and power and control on the institutions that use them. And if you, like me, believe that policing in the United States is a white supremacist institution, that doesn't mean that every cop is a racist. I want to be clear about that. It just means that the institution of policing is both white supremacist and, frankly, anti-poor, and serves the interests historically and in the present of the elite with respect to economic inequality and injustice. So if you believe that, like I do, then you also maybe believe that handing over tools like Stingray surveillance devices that track cell phones, like facial recognition technology, like surveillance cameras, like database systems that enable the police to, you know, look up all kinds of information about any person, even if they're not suspected of a crime. When you consider the amount of surveillance because of technology that police have access to in this country right now, mostly unregulated, and even in cases where there are regulations, very minimally regulated, you begin to understand that we have conferred a lot of power and control and authority, or given a lot of power and control and authority to the police, which again is a white supremacist institution. Policing is a white supremacist institution. So that's a danger, right? And it's a danger for a number of reasons. It's dangerous to individual people of color and poor people who are over-policed by these systems. It is a danger to us as a society because the police resist very, very powerfully any attempt to take power away from them, any attempt to address the harm that they cause, particularly to Black and brown people, but to all people, actually. And so it's almost like a feedback loop of problems where the police have a surveillance technology that confers upon them incredible amount of authority and power and control, because knowledge is power. And then, you know, we're trying to take that power away from them, and they can use the information that they have because of the surveillance technology to protect their ability to use that technology or their other powers, really any way that they want. And unfortunately, we're actually watching this unfold right here in Massachusetts as we speak. So not specific necessarily to the problem of surveillance, although certainly specific to the problem of police powers. So essentially what's happening right now is there's an attempt on the part of organizations like the NAACP and the ACLU to reform qualified immunity laws, which, as you probably know, protect police from unlawful activity on the job. So they protect police from civil liability when they violate people's constitutional rights or even violate statutes, at least if the violation of the law is novel, if it's not exactly what a police officer has done before to someone else. So in a case that that was brought to court and ruled on. So what's happening in Massachusetts is that, you know, community organizations, civil rights organizations, legal reform organizations are calling on the legislature to take some power away from the police. And the police are responding essentially by using their power, knowledge, and authority, some of which is probably gained through the use of surveillance technologies, to bully the state legislature into, you know, basically ensuring the status quo remains. And this gets at the political power of the police, which I think is something that people are afraid to talk about in the United States. In the pages of, for example, the New York Times or the Boston Globe, we don't really read about the political power of the police, but it's profound. It is a profound influence on state and local and federal lawmakers in this country who are responsible for, you know, passing the laws that govern the behavior of the police. So when I think about surveillance, it's not only within the context of how, for example, street level surveillance programs, surveillance technologies facilitate mass incarceration, facilitate the criminalization and control the state's control of poor people, of Black people, of immigrants, again, of dissidents, of Muslims. It is also to think about the ways in which surveillance systems and surveillance technologies enable the police to amass enough power through knowledge to be able to exert control over political systems that aim to regulate them and strip them of their powers as well. So I'm thinking about that right now because it's happening. I'm concerned about it.
Mm. Thank you, KADE. I love though that you really teased out this point around, you know, the questions around power and this idea of, you know, knowledge is power as that kind of informing that maxim that informs a lot of what people think is this movement for liberation, recognizing that, you know, even power is weaponized in this particular moment, and we need to be cautious and careful about that. Does anyone want to build on that question? I'll repeat it again. You know, how do we address issues of racial injustice in surveillance technology?
Well, I'll build off that a little bit. You know, there has to be a reckoning, and you know, part of it starts with a new narrative to this issue of police and the power that they have. You know, I was watching the news the other night because we did a press conference and I wanted to see what type of coverage it got. Every other story, literally, was about the police saving someone or crime. There's a bunch of vandals breaking into buildings, and here's people's surveillance equipment that captured these criminals in the act. And it casts this narrative that is consistent with the idea that we need police to keep us safe. And thrown in there is a story of a shooting where police shot somebody or shot at somebody, but it's told in the story of them fleeing from a scene where someone else is shot. And then at the end, here's a bunch of preachers who are saying there needs to be police reform after we've been inundated with all of these images and messages around why the police are so vital to our safety and existence in society. And I think the problem is this narrative, because there's never stories on the news about the cops that just be harassing kids down Dudley or in Nubian Square, right? Who are just stopping people and pulling them over, and the huge racial disparities that exist and who's being stopped and surveilled and frisked on the streets. Those aren't the stories that we get. We get the story of a state trooper who found a disabled owl on the side of the street and put it in its back seat and took it to the local vet. Like that, those are the heartwarming, feel-good stories that we get about police. And so, you know, I think there needs to be a truth-telling and a reframing of the narrative. And to KADE's point about how this technology kind of metastasizes the power that police have, it's harder to confront that narrative. You know, our national legal director, David Cole, wrote a book called Engines of Liberty, and it really talks about civil society organizations and their ways, in the ways that they had influence on changing the laws, that it wasn't, you know, changing legal strategies per se, but it was about the nation's changed perspective on particular issues, looking at the marriage equality movement, looking at the NRA's efforts to bolster the Second Amendment, and looking at human rights violations in relation to Guantanamo Bay detainees, right? It's our understanding of what these issues meant in popular society or popular media influenced how the courts interpreted these legal issues. And so similarly, we need to reframe the narrative around police and police violence and police surveillance and the tools that police use to maintain white supremacy in this country. And until we do that, you know, until we're successful at that, we're going to continue to be engaged in this uphill slog.
Yeah, one thing I would add is we really need to make sure that at every turn we challenge this idea that surveillance makes people safer. There's very little to no evidence that this is true. And so, for instance, one of the things that will happen often is when it's brought up, you know, law enforcement or government officials will bring up two things: terrorism and protecting children. You know, we can track down, you know, an abducted child, you know, or prevents terrorism. It doesn't. I mean, and you can look through the scholarship of the reports, and like, it's very rare to almost non-existent. But we see that it's used not even in those dire circumstances, right? But in really minor ways, right? Like, to find, you know, I mean, well, I'm struggling to come up with an example right now, but it's often used in ways that don't justify the ways in which it radically shapes and disrupts, like, the tenets of a free society. Um, and so I think one of the ways what we need to do is like make sure that when that comes up, it's pointed out that in fact is often not how it's used, and there's very little evidence from 9/11 on, you know, that the massive surveillance structures have helped make anyone safer. And in fact, I mean, they make marginalized communities much less safe. And so I think that's an important thing to note. And what I would add, I think this is unfortunate, but I believe this is true, is that a lot of white folks think that these mechanisms are only ever going to be for them, used for in their to their advantage, not against them. And part of the problem, you know, say with things like a Ring doorbell or Project Greenlight or lots of other of these technologies, is that people are more invested in, you know, say for a Ring, in the safety of their packages than the safety of Black folks. And so we, in addition to kind of disrupting that narrative about whether or not these things make us safe, we have to get people on board and recognizing who it doesn't make safe and who it doesn't protect and who it endangers, to be in short.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time though, Chris, you know, like you said, those technologies don't necessarily protect even rich white people either, right? Like, you know, there have been so many stories, for example, of Ring systems getting hacked by like random people all over the world who, you know, are now watching your family come and go from the house, you know, pretty easy to figure out when to rob you if they know when you're not home. Another way that knowledge is power, for example. But I just wanted to build on something you guys said, which is that specifically with respect to the way in which police surveillance enables them to control political discourse, right? Like, this is another way that knowledge is power. Like, as RAHSAAN said, you know, they can come out and say, we used facial recognition to arrest this murderer, right? And everybody will be like, oh, facial recognition is so great. It found this murderer, right? Or this kidnapper who kidnapped this child. They don't, however, put out press releases when it was discovered internally that, you know, Sergeant so-and-so was using the technology to identify women he thought were sexy on the internet, and get their addresses so that he could creepily show up at their houses and flirt with them. You know, they're not going to issue a press release when they use the technology to identify the names of activists who appeared at a Black Lives Matter protest. They're not going to release that information to the public. So they get to control the discourse entirely about how these technologies function. And because our country lacks, from beginning to end, an accountability or oversight system, with respect to the police, especially with respect to surveillance technologies, which, you know, the use of which are just entirely secret in the United States, there is no way for either advocates like us at the ACLU or lawmakers or the general public to evaluate whether or not these technologies are being used in a way that advances anything that people in the public would see as a good thing, like, you know, safety, or whether the harms because of either outright abuses, like the use of the technology to identify women for personal purposes, or abuses that the police and maybe even some government officials might condone, like, racial profiling, using technology, or the use of the technology to track and identify dissidents and things like that. We don't get to hear about any of that. And so that's not a part of the conversation, although I can guarantee you it is happening consistently in every police department across the country. And just to give you an example of how much cops abuse their access to database systems and technology systems, here in Massachusetts, there's been, a scandal recently over the state police lying about overtime, so stealing public money effectively. And a bunch of state troopers have been caught stealing public money. Some of them got in a little bit of trouble, but kind of as a part of this investigation, it was discovered that one state trooper routinely misused his access to the criminal offender registry information, the CORI database, querying people's names when he wanted to know, was his neighbor involved in any crimes, because I hate my neighbor, I'd like to mess with this guy, or my daughter is dating a young man, I want to look him up and see if he has a criminal record. This is illegal. It is illegal to do those things under state law in Massachusetts. This guy got caught, the state trooper, and you know what he told a reporter for Commonwealth magazine? He was like, literally every cop I know does this all the time. Like, this happens every single day. This is like not an issue. I don't understand why I'm being punished for this. Like, I get that it's against the law, but like literally every cop does this all the time. So that's just a window into even something that is prohibited by law in Massachusetts, and cops will take it. Oh, we take CORI law very seriously. That's very serious law. Well, according to this state trooper, they don't take it seriously. And so, even when we have, and this is part of the reason that we view these bans on face surveillance technology as so important, because even if you have laws on the books that constrain the behavior of the police with respect to how they can use surveillance technology, how they can query database systems, there's no way to ensure that those laws are followed. Literally none. What are the police going to arrest each other? I mean, we can't go into their fusion centers and tap them on the back and say, hey, what are you searching for? What are you looking up? Like, no one does that. There's just, it's a complete wall of secrecy. So again, this issue of how knowledge is power, the way that they can frame these conversations for the press, for the public, for lawmakers, puts us at the mercy of their version of what they're doing, right? They're telling us about their own behavior, and we don't really get to challenge it that much, and until like grave abuses take place. And then of course we can, marshal those as examples of dangerous.
Yeah, one other thing I would add to Kate's point is not only is the ways that when companies provide these technologies, they also don't do any oversight, And so, for instance, Amazon with recognition will say, well, you should only, have a certain action if there's a 99% chance of, that it's a match, right? But we know police aren't doing that. I mean, for instance, we know that through the work at Georgetown, that in one case, they thought a guy looked like Woody Harrelson, so they submitted an image of Woody Harrelson, to see who the system would return as a match, and they're submitting drawings and things like this. And companies, although they might have some kind of guidelines for how these systems are supposed to be used, they don't at all enforce that. And so that's another way in which it's abused that is not often publicized. And one other thing, it's to build on what both folks have said, there hasn't been a progressive or radical movement in the history of our country that hasn't been surveilled and attempted hasn't been surveilled or attempted to be disrupted by by the powers that be. And so again, that is, and most of those movements were for more rights, right? For to reduce harms, to make a fairer, more equitable society. So the notion that somehow it's going to be used in our favor at some point is it's not one I share.
Thank you. And I feel like we could spend a lot. I have a lot more questions about kind of after hearing your responses. But I'm going to move on, because one of the things I think all of you have touched on something that's really powerful. One being narrative, but two, this idea of these containers or these rules that of accountability that are essentially nebulous containers, and provide this false sense of security. And often, we can talk about, I mean, all of you are familiar with the legislation, that either doesn't exist or should exist to prevent these harms. But as I think the other question is, what can the public do? Do we have to wait? Do we have to wait for a moment where a Willie Lynch is violated, or a Robert Williams is violated because of the misuse of this technology, or is there something that the public can do to address the issue? So that's the first part of my question, and it would be great if you could also just share what can institutions do about this? And I'm not necessarily talking about, legal institutions, but, what can campuses do? What can schools do? What can, beyond the traditional notion of or the traditional confines of institutional responses, what can be done on the people side, and then what can be done on the structure side?
Well, there's three things that I always say when it's the question of what can I do. First is do the knowledge. There are a wealth of resources out there for people to be educated about the threats and the concerns. I think somebody threw something in the chat of what is it? The color of surveillance link. That's a perfect resource, and other resources like that, because I think it's, we run the risk of, depending on our position and level of influence, of undermining movements if we're not in tune with some of the folks who are kind of the most directly impacted and marginalized. And so we're well served by aligning ourselves, or at least understanding and knowing about the perspective, the view, the work of people who are most directly impacted. And so to the extent that we try to educate ourselves, one, just on the substance of the issue, we must also do that in a way that is informed by the people who are either living on the margins or have been marginalized, or are the ones who are most directly experiencing the pain. The second thing that I say is, and it basically, it builds off of the first thing, which is kind of stay woke, right? So part of that is recognizing who to listen to and whose perspective really matters. But then also, watch out for the gaslight, and don't let people in positions of authority and influence try to pull the wool over your eyes. But you're enabled to do that by having done the knowledge. And then 3, get active. Calling your electeds, engaging with the organizations that you are already a part of. For instance, I'm also an ordained reverend in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is the oldest continuously existing Black denomination in America. And there are 12 churches here in Massachusetts that are throughout the state, and we have over 4,000 members. And I held a press conference with the pastors of these churches yesterday on the criminal law reform bill. And I had the pastor of the Plymouth Church talk about the need for having a ban on face surveillance technology. And so I'm engaging a network that I am a part of. They don't know, they haven't done the deep research on this issue, but I have the benefit of having KADE CROCKFORD as my colleague, and having been engaged in this work. And I know the importance of it. And when I shared with these pastors the significance of the aspects of these bills, and mentioned to the pastor in Plymouth that the Police Department was toying around with face surveillance technology, she's like, yeah, I want to talk about that. Right. And so I tapped into the network that I was a part of to get them active. And to the extent that people aren't don't have a network that they're connected to, I think it's important to get connected to an organization, an advocacy organization that is doing justice work and supporting that work. So I think those are some of the things that we individually can do. But I think for institutions, it begins with having the tough conversations and being intentional about centering race in those conversations and how race is impacted and how this the problem around tech surveillance exacerbates issues of racism, but is also driven by racism. To have those hard conversations about how white supremacy operates in society and even within institutions, and then come to an understanding of what the institution's role and responsibility is to dismantle it. And from that, they can develop programming and initiatives and efforts.
Yeah, I would just add to what RAHSAAN said by saying that I think individuals can refuse to be afraid. People can refuse to be afraid of one another. We can refuse to be afraid of other countries. We can refuse to be afraid of the police and the president. And I think that's really important, because when we act from fear, we are not acting in the best interest of our future selves often, especially politically. Sometimes we have to act from fear to protect our physical bodies, but fear is not a healthy motivator, I don't think, politically. And the second thing I think is that we can, as individuals, ask for what we actually want and stop negotiating against ourselves. We should stop saying, well, we're never going to get X, Y, Z, so we should just ask for some sort of middle ground thing. That's not what our enemies do, and they win a lot. And so we've adopted a new strategy for us, which is to stop negotiating against ourselves and to ask for what we actually want in this campaign around face surveillance, right? We want a ban on face surveillance. So that's what we're asking for. And believe it or not, we're winning, right? I mean, we've succeeded in that respect, in achieving that goal over and over again. And I think that's actually because when you have moral clarity, people are more likely to want to ride with you. You know what I mean? It's difficult to get a whole coalition. Hey, you want to help us out on a piece of legislation that creates very complicated regulations governing how police can use it? People are like, no, I don't really want to do that. You're like, hey, you want to join us and ban face surveillance? People are like, yeah, let's go. So there's moral clarity. It gets people excited to work on issues with you. So yeah, don't be afraid, and don't negotiate against yourself, I would say. Act from love and compassion and solidarity, and have a big vision. And then with respect to institutions, I think that we can call on institutions to act the same way, right? To, instead of putting surveillance cameras all over the place because they're afraid of, somebody getting mugged on campus or something, or using facial surveillance technology because they fear, serious crime, to instead approach those issues from a different perspective, which is to think about, what safety means to students. Talk about that, right? So is the concern that you're worried about safety? Okay, let's ask students what safety means to them, right? And maybe safety means something radically different. Maybe safety to students actually means, well, I'd like to have more Black professors because I don't feel comfortable in the classroom, especially, at a moment like this, talking about white supremacy when, I don't see anybody in positions of authority who looks like me, right? That's a radically different understanding of safety than, putting surveillance cameras all over the place. Or I don't feel safe because, I actually don't have enough money to eat. And that obviously makes me feel unsafe. So asking institutions to engage in that process too, of interrogating, what it means to be safe, and asking those institutions to lead with values that do not come out of a place of fear.
A couple things I would add is and just build on what both folks have said, is these companies are constantly lying to us. And so one of the most important things we can do is find out where, what sort of the truth is, right? So like when a company says, well, we can tell by the way someone walks whether or not they present a threat. Like, no, you can't do that. You actually can't. It's not possible, or we can tell, we can predict like the 7 emotions that people like. No, you can't. You can't. So it's unfortunate that governments, and institutions keep accepting these lies. But we can, I mean, there's lots of research out there that points to why these things are faulty. But the other thing is, there's tons of grassroots work that's being done, by the communities who these technologies are aimed to harm. For example, the community of tenants who fought up against face surveillance in New York. And I think when we talk to the people who supposedly are being helped by these technologies, when, again, as Kate said, when we talk to them about what safety means, right, or what their actual needs are, rather than searching for a technological fix, which often is not. I think that those are really important things we can do. And I even for my own institution, right? Like it's important to find community and push back against these things because it's very easy. I think people in power are often looking for quick fixes or the notion that like if you can bring in a kiosk that tells people temperatures and unlocks the door, that's somehow gonna like make it safe to go back to school or something, right? Like it doesn't. It's not. And so we need to again find community with people who will push back on those easy answers, which are not actually going to fix the thing that it purports to fix.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you're, absolutely right on all 3 fronts. And I'm really glad that each of you talked about one, activating your own network. So I think we're in a moment where everyone's looking around and trying to figure out, where do I go? How do I align myself? How do I make these choices? Not recognizing that we're already tapped into our own communities. And so for those who are looking for ways to resist, ways to have conversations, ways to, build education and knowledge around how to be an ally or how to, contribute to movements, contribute to others' movements and actions around dismantling these systems, you can start with your own community. Also recognizing that out in the world, the thing that we can do is notice that there are companies and problem solvers and innovators and whatever they want to call themselves that think they have the quick and easy answer, and often these answers are based on some very troubling and very dangerous assumptions. But these folks get funded to do this. These companies get funded to do this. And so recognizing and being able to spot that, or at least being able to challenge and create some friction around these claims is especially important. And, speaks to that whole, your point, RAHSAAN, about, stay woke meaning I don't want to just know what these terms mean. I don't want to just talk about and understand white supremacy, but I also want to understand the sources where I get my information from, the validity of these sources, and the quality of the information coming out of that. And so all of that to say, I think that, there's a ton of food for thought here. And I want to share that, our panelists have also shared a few articles that we're going to circulate to folks after this, just for anyone that wants to do some additional reading. And you can also obviously follow the work that KADE, Kristen, and RAHSAAN are doing in their respective spaces online on Twitter. I'm going to move on to the final question, which is a very open-ended question. Where do we go from here?
I mean, I think what Kate said at the outset is really important. That I like the way you phrase it, Kate. Like our enemies are working hard against us, And, you know, and I want to be very careful about how I say this. I don't, where we find ourselves is out of uh, a lot of tragedy. You know, that we are here because of the abuse of power and, you know, the murder of Black folks. And so I don't want to, you know, I hesitate to use kind of the word opportunity or something like that, but I want, you know, like it's a time when like a lot of things that didn't seem possible are now, you know, widely discussed, and you know, in fact, there are some gains. And so I think that we keep fighting and keep pushing, and again, like not in a way that what I might call it is unyielding. And again, I'm not in a lot of ways, I'm just mirroring what KADE and RAHSAAN have already said. But like I think that it's very much now possible or seen as possible widely. Some things that even a year or two ago people were saying like was not, like, you know, was fantasy. And so I just think we keep pushing.
Yeah, I don't know that there's a whole lot more to say beyond what Chris just said, and what KADE has already said. I just think where do we go from here is to the streets, both literally and figuratively, and really do that narrative shifting work. I think that is what is ultimately important. We've got to disabuse ourselves, our friends, our family, our networks of this notion of what public safety means, because the extent to which surveillance is a tool of furthering public safety, it's a very dangerous tool with deadly outcomes. And we need to deconstruct that. So we got to take it to the streets.
The only thing I'd add to that is to also take it to the ballot box. You know, obviously November is going to be huge for this country and for the world. And I'm a big proponent of involvement in local politics. Obviously, you know, whoever is the president and whoever controls the Senate is really important. But the issues that we're talking about now are also determined in large part by who is your mayor or your city manager, who is your city councilor. And, you know, we wouldn't have been successful passing 7 bans at the municipal level on face surveillance in Massachusetts if we didn't have good, solid, progressive people running and winning local office, running for and winning local office. And so I want more people to do all the things that RAHSAAN and Chris have said, but also to remember that, you know, when the rubber hits the road, the people who make the decisions about how much money the police have, about what their authorities will be, are elected. And so you better pay attention to who those people are and what they're doing. And you know, I can't stress enough how much state and local politics on those issues really do matter. And what's beautiful about state and local politics is that unlike Congress, it's much easier to influence. So you and a band of your friends can have a major impact especially at the municipal level, at the city level. And it's also really fun. I love local politics. It's like an episode of Parks and Rec unfolding before your eyes every day. So I encourage you to get involved in politics if you're not.
One other thing I would add, and this kind of goes to everything everyone else was saying, is you know, so for instance, I don't know anyone who uses Nextdoor. You know, I don't know people who have Rings or Amazon Alexas or things like that. You know, I think you know, and I like the effects of this might in some ways be small, but I think, you know, first of all, we got to talk to our people, you know, get our people. But also, I mean, there's some element, I think my friends would be ashamed to have a ring, you know, because they know what I do and I talk to them, you know, like I'm not coming over to your house, you know, like we're not, like, I mean, I'm not going over anyone's house now, but like, like, but you know, if you got a Ring or an Alexa, or you know, if you're on Nextdoor or Neighbors, like we're probably not friends. And so I think that we need to continue to do those things, you know, to the extent that we can do them.
Absolutely. So I heard, you know, keep pushing and talk to your people, create real consequences. You're not just going to get, exactly. Shame is a powerful weapon. Take it to the streets, literally and figuratively. You know, look at the organizing that's happening on the ground, but also remember to take it to the ballot box. You know, that's what I heard you all say. And I think all really strong points in terms of where we're going, because, you know, this moment where we wanted the world, you know, we wanted the world to wake up has finally happened. And so now that we've got the attention, you know, there are plenty of ways now, I think, that we can continue the momentum of the many people, the many movements, the many organizers who have been doing this work day in and day out, you know, before this moment of global reckoning. So I'm gonna turn it back over to the panelists and ask you, or offer you the opportunity to ask each other or the audience a question. And then we have a few questions from the audience, and we can get to that at the very end. So whoever would like to go first, is there a question that you would like to pose to your fellow panelists or to the audience more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this perhaps before we started recording, and KADE and RAHSAAN, you could both give me your answer. I'd love to hear it. You know, I think as we've seen, there have been municipalities, you know, in certain areas that have had lots more success in getting some of these bans and things like that. You know, and Detroit's working hard at it. But you know, I'd like to know if you think, what are the conditions you think that are in Massachusetts that kind of, I'm not asking this the right way, like how, like what would you say is specific about your location that has allowed you, or if not, you know, you can just say not, but has created the conditions for the successes that you've had?
So I think that's a really important question. And there are a couple of ways of answering it. I'll start by saying what I said at the beginning, at the outset of this conversation, which is that we would not be successful had it not been for the work of Joy Buolamwini and other Black scholars on face recognition algorithms and the bias, or the visioning that we've seen, the abolitionist visioning that we've seen from Black radical activists in this country that has helped people expand their view of what's possible. So those are kind of like the political and academic conditions that, you know, created fertile ground for our ability to pass these measures. And that's not an exaggeration. Like literally every piece of testimony that I submitted to any city council referenced that, you know, seminal work, Gender Shades, from Joy Buolamwini at MIT, which, you know, is in Massachusetts. So people like that too. But the other way to answer the question is almost to go back to what I just said, which is that in Massachusetts, we have a pretty robust tradition of local government, and people are involved in their local government in some places quite a bit. So for example, in Brookline, which is a town, the only town, we've done this in 7 municipalities, 6 cities and 1 town, they have a town meeting system in Brookline. So I can't tell you how many meetings I had to go to, advisory boards, you know, sub-advisory committees, they got this and that and this and that. But people are very engaged in the process at the local level. And so it's not a situation where, you know, you have maybe like 10 city councilors who, you know, nobody really pays attention to local elections, and they're all kind of people who have been in politics forever, and, you know, they've all got connections to real estate developers, and, you know, they don't give a shit what the people have to say. In the communities that we worked in throughout Massachusetts, it's really not like that. These are people who are, you know, representing the communities that they come out of, that they are, you know, these are elected officials who really are responsive to the demands of the people in their communities. And that matters a lot. So again, you know, like in the city of Boston, for example, we've seen a huge transformation in recent years, actually really since Ayanna Pressley became the first Black woman to ever sit on the Boston City Council about 10 years ago at this point, maybe even a little longer than that. And of course, now she's a congresswoman, but before that, she was the first Black woman on the Boston City Council. And that was a huge seismic shift in Boston politics, because what we saw was that the old guard, mostly white, predominantly male, predominantly representing, you know, business interests, not really interested in civil rights issues, was on its way out. And now our council is a majority women. It has, I think, half of the members are people of color, are approaching that. The council president is a Black woman, my council president, Kim Janey. And not only is there representation in terms of gender and race on the council, but there's also representation in terms of politics. So we have, you know, the most progressive, you know, civil rights oriented city council that we've ever had. And that's happening as well in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is the other major city where we passed a ban like this. You know, the old white power structure that used to govern municipal politics in Massachusetts is crumbling. And what's replacing it is new leaders who are more reflective of the communities that they serve, both in terms of their skin tone, their gender, but then also in terms of their politics. So I think that's a huge part of the reason why we've been able to succeed in Massachusetts in so many places. That's because local government is increasingly democratic and increasingly representative of the communities that they serve. So we've, you know, and I mean, we busted our ass. I'm not gonna lie, we've been working hard for the past year, and you know, that's a part of it too.
Yeah, I was just gonna chime in there. And it's like, yeah, but we got like KADE Crockford too, who is, you know, noted in this area. Our legislators respect her knowledge and work, as well as folks in the community. And I think that's another key piece, is when you've got grassroots organizations that are ready to throw in on something that a grass tops organization like the ACLU has prioritized. That says a lot, and it's a lot in part because of KADE's work and the relationships that she's cultivated.
So does anyone else have a question for one of your fellow panelists?
Yeah, I do, but I also just want to say one more thing about that answer. And when I say we have been busting our ass, I mean like a coalition, not just the ACLU. I mean, so like in Boston, for example, the face surveillance ban work was led by the ACLU of Massachusetts in partnership with Muslim Justice League, Student Immigrant Movement, and Unafraid Educators, which is sort of like the radical arm of the Boston Teachers Union. And BTU was really instrumental in that campaign as well. But we had like, I mean, so at the hearing, you know, I don't know, over 100 people testified, and a bunch of them were immigrant youth mobilized by Student Immigrant Movement, one of whom was 8 years old, actually. I think the youngest person to ever testify at the Boston City Council. So anyway, you know, it's a coalition. It takes a whole community of organizers and of organizations to move legislation like this successfully. So my question, Chris, is for you, which is, you know, as you see organizations like the ACLU and the organizations that we work with in the advocacy space take on face surveillance as a major priority, you know, you've probably watched the other work that we've done in the surveillance space over the years too. Is there something that stands out for you as like, you know, wow, I really wish these advocacy organizations would take on this thing, because I don't see anybody taking this on. You know, you're such a astute watcher of these issues and of the company. So I'm wondering, like, not doing.
So I think I've thought about this question a lot, you know, and I think one of the difficulties I have, and in fact, I think the last time we were on a panel, I think it was a CLIC panel, you articulated something that I think is super important because, so it's a long answer, but I'm going to try and make it more concise. One of my biggest problems, and I think a thing that most people, present company accepted, don't understand is the lack of a distinction between public and private surveillance networks, right? In that, there's so many carve outs and allowances and weird laws or lack of laws that, so like if the police, for instance, aren't allowed to follow you, all day, every day, for 3 years without, a warrant, or, if the warrant has limits or whatever, like they can just go buy that information from someone in a lot of cases. I don't think people understand that, or a lot of people. And so my difficulty a lot of times is where when institutions or activist groups focus on a lot of these technologies in the public arena, but not the private arena, right? But KADE, when last time we spoke on a panel, you talked about like why organizations tend to do it that way, and specifically why the ACLU tends to do it that way. And if you could talk about that again, I think it'll be really important. Does this make sense what I'm saying?
Yep, totally, yeah. So yeah, we typically focus on government conduct first, not exclusively, but first, for two main reasons. One is because even though Jeff Bezos is very rich and powerful, he still can't arrest me or kill me lawfully, which, the police can. And then the other reason is more political, basically, which is that like whenever we deal with issues related to surveillance in the legislature or in city halls rather, we have two main enemies, right? Or opponents. One is the police and the security agencies, and the other is the tech companies. And so we would like to win. And it's very difficult to do that when both of those people are punching you in the nose at the same time. It's easier to do it. You can bob and weave when you just have one of those guys trying to hit you. When they're both coming at you, it's very hard for an organization like the ACLU or any other advocacy group to be able to outmaneuver, the lobbying weight of both the cops and the tech companies at the same time. So that's why I try to adopt a strategy that says, let's do them one at a time, right? And then it's also easier because if you can, for example, get restrictions or a ban on government use of face surveillance technology, for example, it's then a lot easier to convince the legislature or the city council that they ought to look at the private companies too, because you can say, hey, look, you already banned this for the police. You're acknowledging that this is a very dangerous technology, right? So why do you think these private companies should be able to do this? There are obviously huge issues with that too. So let's address that. So yeah, part of the reason is political, really, that it's too difficult to fight both of those, institutions at once.
Thank you.
Some tips on political strategy for sure. Small p and capital P politics. Thank you for that. RAHSAAN, do you have a question? If not, I can turn it over with the questions that we have from the audience.
Yeah, I have a question for the audience, which is
Perfect.
what in this conversation around tech surveillance and the dangers of it, what is the biggest yes but that you feel is disrupting or interfering with our ability to be successful? And what are the strategies or messaging that would be effective in your mind?
So if everyone's wondering, how do I answer this question? Where do I answer this question? Obviously, if you're joining us on Zoom, you can answer and provide your feedback in the chat. You can also follow CLIC on Twitter and tweet out your responses. You'll see that we've tagged our panelists, so you can respond to them that way. We are at NUSLCLIC, NUSLCLIC. And we're happy to share that as well. And you can also, of course, engage your networks as we talked about earlier. So there are 3 questions, and I'm gonna give everyone an opportunity to think about which one question they want to answer. I think that's probably the best way, because we are we're 1 minute away from the time that we'd scheduled to end this, but I want to keep this conversation going, if that's okay with you, but also make sure that we are also responding to our audience who are joining us via live stream and also on Zoom. So here are the 3 questions. Question 1 is, how do we actively change the narrative of policing to being vital to our safety? That's question 1. The second question is, what is the role of education in this movement for in this movement for racial injustice? Many schools use surveillance technologies in the name of academic integrity, but do they normalize surveillance? And talk about that. And then the final question is, what are your thoughts on tech solutions to counter surveillance technology that targets oppressed people? So for example, a security researcher could reverse engineer an ankle monitor and share an exploit to disable it. So those are the 3 questions.
I love the last question, so I'm just gonna jump in with that real quick. I'm always wary of tech solutionism, because I think that it doesn't address the underlying political conditions that enable bad technology or harmful uses of technology. That said, I'm a huge user of encryption. So, you know, I do believe that liberatory technology is necessary and that people ought to be building it, and that we have to defend it and advocate for it. At the same time, you know, we need laws that protect encryption. So we need to do both. We need to have technology that promotes liberation and helps people get free and stay free, and we need laws that ensure that we can do that, and that that protect the existence of those tools. On the question of whether you should hack a GPS shackle, I just want to say you should definitely hire a lawyer. I'm not going to counsel you to do anything illegal. You know, I think it's fantastic for people to be thinking of ways that they can use their technical skills to increase the amount of freedom and justice in this world.
Thanks. So I'll just repeat the other 2 questions. How do we actively change the narrative of policing to being vital to our safety? And then the second one, what is the role of education in this? Many schools use surveillance tech in the name of academic integrity, but do they further normalize surveillance?
I'll take the ed tech question. I mean, the short answer is yes. You know, and again, like, these companies make claims. So like, essentially they're lying. So like, I'm not saying company A is lying, so I won't get sued, but they're all lying. Like, they claim their technology does a thing that it doesn't. And by the way, even if it did, right? So even if a certain company was able to sort of guarantee you know, academic integrity, you know, I wonder about a society where we've decided that it's more important to catch someone, you know, plagiarizing, you know, or cheating on a test than it is to endanger them by exposing them to pervasive surveillance. You know, like, I think one of those is a far greater harm than the other, you know, and so in my work, I try as much as possible to again, disabuse people of the notion that surveillance is somehow equals care or safety or ensures honesty, because it doesn't.
Thank you. That I think this third question responds to RAHSAAN, your points around reconstructing narratives. So how do we change the narrative of policing being vital to our safety? If so, how?
Yeah, we've got to talk about all of the harms that policing creates, and dismantle or disabuse people of this notion of the value that they bring. When we look at the overwhelming majority of what police actually shocked and appalled to know how many motorly conduct or disturbing the peace or, you know, schoolyard fights, things like that, that is just like there should be other alternatives. And so again, it goes along with that truth-telling narrative and put out the harms, and to the extent that there are the, you know, the headlines, the rapes and the murders and the armed robberies and home invasions, when those statistics are compared to the greater majority of cases that police are involved in, that's how we can begin to shift that. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us to get access to that information. If we have it already, share that information and push back against the people who put forward the narrative that we need police to keep us safe.
Thank you for that. So that is all for this session. I want to thank our panelists and the audience for just creating this space with CLIC and having, I think, a really important discussion in this moment about where, you know, surveillance tech is going, but particularly the implications for Black, for Indigenous, for, you know, and for communities of color, and really highlighting the particular impact that this moment is having for Black people, Black bodies, and Black lives. So our next discussion is next week, Tuesday at the same time. We're going to talk about contact tracing, health data records, and vulnerable communities. And that is going to be another extension of the conversation that we're having around surveillance. And so I want to thank KADE, Chris, and RAHSAAN for helping us kick this series off. We hope to do more like this, so we hope to have you again and again and again as we continue to convene these conversations. Thank you all very much. And to our audience, as I said, we're going to circulate any articles and any resources that might be helpful if you're curious about learning more about this issue. So thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful week.